And that's it for this course section. In this course section, we built this Flutter learning quiz, where we can answer Flutter-related questions. And after we answer these questions, we get this result screen where we can see which questions were answered correctly and which answers would have been the correct answers for the different questions. From this result screen, we can then of course also restart the quiz and give it another try where we might do better. Now, whilst building this app, we again learned way more about Flutter and also Dart. We of course used the knowledge we already gained in the previous course section. For example, the knowledge that this main function in the main.dart file is the main entry point, since it's executed automatically by Dart when the app starts, and that you must then call run app and pass your widget tree to it. But in this section, we built way more widgets. We passed data around between those widgets, including more complex data like functions. In this section, you learned that in your widgets, you can actually also accept functions as input values, as arguments, and that you can then use these functions in your widgets, for example, to bind them to buttons, and that you can therefore also create and then set those functions as values for those arguments that want functions. You learned that you can pass functions as values, which is a crucial pattern that will be needed quite a lot when building more complex Flutter apps. You also learned that you can output conditional content with help of the if keyword, for example, which allows you to set a variable, in this case here, to different values based on different state values. And then this variable can be used to output it in the widget tree, and therefore, since the variable contains different values based on different state values, the UI looks different for those different states. And that's exactly what conditional content is all about, having different UI states for different conditions. You did also not just learn about the if statement, which is a great way of setting content conditionally, but you also learned about using ternary expressions, which gives you a more concise but sometimes also harder to read and understand way of setting content conditionally. And you even learned that you could manage entire widgets as state values, though you also learned that this can have some disadvantages, especially if those widgets then must receive some data, like for example a pointer at a function. But you learned about these different approaches, and you did also not just learn about if statements, but also about for loops, which is another crucial Dart concept, actually a feature you find in many programming languages, as it allows you to execute the same piece of code repeatedly until some condition is not met anymore. And here we used a for loop to go through all the answers chosen by a user and create some summary data pieces based on these answers. And these summary data pieces were actually so-called maps, another built-in value type in Dart, which allows you to quickly combine different key value pairs into one object. The alternative would have been to build a custom class as a blueprint for a custom object, and this would have also yielded various benefits, especially regarding type safety. Because you did see that when using a map, you have to do a lot of type casting to tell Dart which type of value is stored under a specific key in such a map. But it's nonetheless very important to know about this map value, since you will also encounter and use that quite a bit when working with Flutter. In addition to these Dart features and patterns, we also learned about some new widgets, like for example the single child scroll view widget, which can be used to make its child widget, often a column, scrollable, which is something we use here on this final results page to make this box in the middle here scrollable, whilst still restricting it in size, in height specifically. You also saw some new configuration items and styling options in action, like for example the shape option for elevated buttons to add rounded borders to the button. And in general, you of course saw many examples for the usage and configuration of various Flutter widgets. Last but not least in this section, we also used the class keyword for something else than a custom widget. Of course, you will very often create custom widgets, stateless widgets, or stateful widgets. But in Dart, you can also use the class keyword to build standard classes, standard blueprints for standard objects that don't act as widgets, to, for example, build a blueprint for an object that contains the question text and its possible answers, as well as a utility method for shuffling those answers and returning a new list of shuffled answers. That is what we used a custom class for in this section. And speaking of shuffling answers, in this section you also learn about various methods that can be called on lists to manipulate or analyze those lists. For example, the shuffle method, which can be called on a list to change the order of list items, but also the add method to add new entries to a list, and the where method to filter a list to create a new list that only contains the list entries where a certain condition is met. In addition, you also learned about the map method, which can also be called on a list to generate a new list of transformed list items, which we, for example, used to transform our list of string answers to a list of tappable answer button widgets. You also learned about this special spread operator here, the 3 dots operator, which can be used to pull all the list elements out of a list and add them as standalone comma-separated items to a surrounding list. In this case here, used to get all the transformed answer button widgets out of that answer button widget list and add them as standalone comma-separated items to the list that is passed as a value to the children argument of the surrounding column. And therefore, at this point, you have a solid Flutter foundation. You learned about many key Dart and Flutter concepts and patterns. Concepts and patterns you will need for the rest of this course and probably for pretty much all Flutter apps you're about to build. And I can really only recommend that you also use this knowledge and build some basic demo apps. In this course, we're now going to dive even deeper into Flutter in the next course sections. We're again going to see all these things and features we already learned about in action, hence also practicing those features again, but we're also going to learn about many new crucial features.